Hi everyone. So today we're talking about solving equations with square roots. And before I actually get into the process of solving these equations, I just want to clarify something because this compared to what we did yesterday can get a little bit confusing. So yesterday we were focusing on simplifying. And when you're simplifying, that's when you're doing math. Okay, I know that sounds weird to say. Okay, but simplify is when you're doing math. You're multiplying, you're adding, you're doing all of those kinds of things, and you're following order of operations when you simplify. Solving is when you're undoing math. Okay, solving is when you're trying to undo things. So if you see addition, you're going to reverse it with subtraction. If you see multiplication, you're going to reverse it with division. This is where you're trying to find x. Okay, so solving is when you're trying to find what a variable is equal to. Okay, so yesterday we were simplifying. So when I handed you something like x plus 4 squared, you were actually doing x plus 4 and squaring it, right? You were taking the parenthesis and writing it out twice and multiplying it all out. That was us doing math, right? But when you solve, that's when you're trying to get x back out, okay? And that's what we're focusing on today. So today, we're talking about solving. And everything we're doing today is us undoing the math, okay? When you are solving, there will be no FOIL, okay? That is the big mistake that people make here because we just learned FOIL. And so people will see problems that have, like for example, if you look at that challenge problem down at the bottom where you have this, people will see this and think that it needs to be FOILed. That's simplifying, okay? That's multiplying everything out. We don't want to simplify, we want to solve, meaning we want to undo everything, we want to take everything apart, okay? So, for example, in this very first one, if I am solving, I'm trying to get the x by itself, so I'm trying to undo what's here, right? The very first thing I'm going to undo is that plus 3. So I'm going to go minus 3 and minus 3, because that's how I undo a plus 3. And I end up with x squared equals 25. And then I want to ask myself, how do I undo an x squared? Well, that's with a square root, and this is the big thing today. And actually, we've talked about this already. We talked about this in chapter 5. When you take a square root, as soon as you take a square root, you end up with two different answers, okay? So the square root of x squared is just x, but x could equal 5, or x could equal negative 5. So every time you solve and it has an x squared in it, you're going to end up with two answers. Okay? Anytime you have something squared, you're going to have two solutions. And there actually are a couple of exceptions to that we'll talk about later. But I want you to kind of get this in your mind. As soon as you see x squared, I want you to be expecting two solutions. Okay? Because every time you take a square root, which is what you're going to have to do with an x squared, you get a positive answer and a negative answer. Okay? So looking at the next one, think of this kind of like when we did the absolute value stuff. Remember the first thing we did was clear everything away from the brackets. Now I'm going to clear everything away from the x squared. So the first thing I'm going to undo is this minus 2. So we're going to go plus 2 and plus 2. I end up with 4x squared equals 144. Don't take a square root yet. That's another mistake people make a lot here. We're not ready to take a square root. First, we need to get rid of that 4. So divide by 4, divide by 4. Okay, and I end up with x squared equals, let's see, I want to say, it's 36. Yeah, x squared equals 36. Take a square root. And as soon as I take a square root, I'm going to get a split. So x could equal 6, or x could equal negative 6. Okay, those are my two solutions. And up here I had these. Okay, so let's think about that next one. First thing I would do is get rid of that plus 5. So minus 5 minus 5. Okay, so now I have 1/2 x squared equals negative 2. And then think about how we could get rid of the 1/2. I would get rid of it by multiplying by the reciprocal. So I would multiply by 2. Okay, so I end up with x squared equals negative 4. Okay, then I would take a square root, but there's a problem here. Okay, we can't take a square root of a negative number. Now, I can't make that call, just like when we did absolute value. You can't make that call until you're actually at this step. So like when I look at, oh, I don't even see another one on here. That's obvious. But if I had a negative number over here at the beginning of the problem, I can't make the decision until I've actually moved all the other stuff around and I'm down to just the x squared. But this right here is where I run into trouble, because I can't take a square root of a negative number. Can't take square root of a negative number. Okay? So as soon as you get to the point where you're taking the square root of a negative number, we can say no solution. Okay? So we are going to have ones here that come out to be no solution. So I'm going to kind of just highlight some of our little tips here. Most of the time when you have x squared in your equation, you have two solutions, except in situations like this where you have no solution because you can't take a square root of a negative number. Okay? Okay, so moving on to the next one. First thing I would do is subtract a 10 and subtract a 10, and I end up with negative 2x squared is equal to negative 2. And I may be thinking this is a no solution one, but remember I can't make that decision until I'm ready to square root, and I'm not ready to square root yet because I have to get rid of the negative 2 first. Divide by negative 2, and I end up with x squared equals 1. Okay, take a square root. I have no problems with this. X equals 1 or x equals negative 1. You will get it wrong if you forget the second answer. The second answer is important. And the problem is your calculator doesn't give you the second answer. Your calculator will only, like if you type in square root of 1, it's only going to tell you 1. This has to come from your brain. Okay, you have to be smart enough to know that this answer exists. Okay, let's look at number 5, and I think there's another exception that comes up here. First thing I would do, subtract 4. So I end up with negative 2x squared equals 0. Don't let that freak you out. Just like normal, divide by negative 2, divide by negative 2, and I end up with x squared equals 0. Now, can I take a square root of 0? Well, it's not negative, right? Negative numbers cause me problems, but 0 isn't negative. I can take a square root of 0, but here's the thing. If I take a square root of 0, technically I get x equals 0 or x equals negative 0. But negative 0 is not a thing. Okay, there's no such thing as x equals negative 0. So this answer, really, we just get x equals 0 or x equals 0. Okay, and so this is the only exception. This is the only time we have one solution. Is when we end up with x squared equals 0. Okay, because 0, when you take a square root of it, you only have one answer. Okay. Okay, and a challenge problem here. So this time we've got some parentheses with that square. And again, I cannot emphasize this enough. If we're trying to solve, we do not want to FOIL. Do not FOIL here if you're trying to solve. Okay? Do not FOIL when you're trying to solve. What we are going to do is treat this like we did when we did the absolute value equations. We're smart enough to know that we can't distribute that 3 in there, right? And we talked about this yesterday, that you can't put the 3 inside the parentheses with that square. And I'm not going to FOIL this, so what can I do? Well, I can get rid of the 3 by dividing. Okay? And now I have x minus 4 squared equals 81. Continue to resist the urge to FOIL. Do not FOIL. Okay? If I'm trying to get x by itself, I need to somehow bust x out of these parentheses. These parentheses are like jail, and the square is like the guard. So we need to think about, how do we get rid of the guard? Well, the opposite of squaring is square rooting. So I'm going to take a square root right now. And as soon as I take a square root, I know that I'm going to split, okay, into 9 and negative 9. The weird thing about this one is that on this side, I'm not left with just x this time. I'm left with x minus 4. So I have x minus 4 equals 9, and x minus 4 equals negative 9. Two separate problems. Now, in all these other ones, when I did that split, I was done, okay? As soon as I did my split here, I had my 2 different answers, and I was done with the problem. Here, I'm not done, okay? I'm going to add 4 and add 4, and I end up with, I'll just put this way down here, x equals 13. Here, I'm going to add 4 and add 4, and I end up with x equals negative 5, okay? And these are your 2 solutions. So they don't always come out to be the same number even, okay? You do your split as soon as you take the square root, and then if you have more solving to do after that, so be it. Go ahead and do more solving, okay? Okay, I think that covered everything you're going to need for today. There will be a check for understanding posted on GoFormative that I'd like you to go give a try. So you're going to do that first. Excuse me. And then your homework assignment is located in your homework packet. It's just more problems like this. Okay? Make sure that's done for tomorrow, and I'll see you tomorrow.